Hello, Barry Dent here with another video about the ecological restoration of Puangiangi Island, Cook Strait, New Zealand. This time I want to look at the human history of the island, and the video will probably extend over several parts, this being part one. It's not a comprehensive history of everything that happened in the country or in this region, but more as people directly impinged upon this island, and in particular talk about what impact people have had on the ecology of the island and on what caused it to be in the state it is today. 100 kilometres that way to the southeast is the site of earliest human settlement in the country, the Wairo Bar near Blenheim. Carbon dating has that at about AD 1350. Local people who perhaps might know better think it dates back well earlier than that. So it's reasonable to assume that people came here quite early on in the history of human settlement in the country. Whether they lived here or just visited for seasonal food gathering, I don't know. It may be that there was reliable permanent water on the island when everything was covered in vegetation rather than reverting as we see it today. This is a stream bed here, and it may have run to the beach. Behind me is an exposure which contains charcoal, burnt rocks, shell, pieces of argillite being found on adjacent D'Urville Island and used for the creation of tools in the early days. I'm very unsure as to the age of that, so we won't go poking around in there anymore. Suffice it to say that every beach in this area has got something like it, and argillite flakes are all over the place on beaches. There's a lot been picked up from the island over the years, and I've brought a few examples with me today. This is a piece of greywacke, and it would have been used as a pounding stone. Now, why isn't it just a randomly shaped piece of greywacke? Because although this is greywacke, it's severely weathered and very soft. This is much firmer, typical greywacke, and you can imagine this being selected with great care from one of the riverbeds inland. These are pieces of argillite which have been knapped into axe heads, adze heads. I suspect that these lost a bit too much of an edge, or the shape didn't turn out right, and so these were discarded rather than going on to become the finished product. The botany of the island tells us a little bit about human settlement as well. We've got three types of plant here which are associated with early people bringing them as food sources and growing them wherever they set ashore. We've got the karaka, the tree, which has got the large orange fruits which are edible after a great deal of processing. Cabbage tree, te koka, various parts of that are edible, and also ringa lily. The ringa have had their DNA done by Lara Shepherd at Te Papa, and they're very typical of the plant that was taken around the area for food sources. So it's unlikely that it, and indeed the other two species, were here naturally to start with. They're a sign of human settlement. I don't know when human settlement or human visitation started here, but we might get some idea from the name of the island, Puangiangi. Now, it's fashionable in some circles to break Maori names down syllable by syllable and ascribe some meaning to them, and I've seen this island be described as a windy place, or a place with lots of lumps and bumps based on some spurious analysis of the name. I think people find that relatively offensive, and help is at hand. We've got the clue that we need in the treaty settlement documents of the two local iwi today, Ngāti Koata and Ngāti Kuia, both of whom quote a particular fragmentary whakapapa which contains the name Puangiangi. Now, whakapapa can be the entire genealogy, generation after generation after generation, or they can be just the salient features of great importance. We don't know which this is, but the treaty settlement document has Puangiangi being son or daughter, probably daughter, of a person called Tūmata Kokiri. Tūmata Kokiri came to the area in probably about the 1600s he founded at some point the iwi Ngāti Tūmata Kokiri, which is part of the Kura Haupo Alliance. Ngāti Tūmata Kokiri persisted in the area for a couple of hundred years until they were eventually driven west and all but exterminated in 1810. Ngāti Tūmata Kokiri were the people who gave Abel Tasman a hostile reception west of here in 1642. One of the modern iwi, Ngāti Kuia, is part of the so-called Kura Haupo Alliance as well, and although they're not contemporaneous really with Tūmata Kokiri here, it might explain why Tūmata Kokiri appears in their lineage, and so that's how the island will have acquired its name. What did the earliest people do to the ecology? They had fire, assuming this does date back, and so some of the forest cover will have been heavily modified. Maybe some of the large flightless birds were eaten, 3 species of food plant were planted, but apart from that, the early people trod very lightly on the land. This is the southwestern tip of the island, right next to the salt turf, which I talked about in one of the other videos about the vegetation of the island. This is the first opportunity to talk about any history of Europeans in the area. And on Christmas Day, 1642, Abel Tasman rode out a storm right out there. And to commemorate that, in 1969, L.W. Field requested that the point right behind me be named First Christmas Point in honour of that occasion when Abel Tasman rode out the storm nearby. His suggestion wasn't taken up, and the point remains nameless and windy and precipitous. I'm just along from spot height 120 in the centre of the island, up on a flat spot next to the coastal cliffs here on the eastern side of the island. In 2012 we did our major botanical and ecological survey, and one of our consultant ecologists was also an amateur archaeologist, and he was quite excited by what he found here. There's some terraced areas which even to me look distinctly made by people, and along there is a very convincing ditch structure. We don't know when this dates to, but past Ngākiori or the Jags, there's North Island and Kapiti. By about 1821, Ngāti Koata and Ngāti Toa were in strife in their home in Kawhia, further up the North Island, and Te Rauparaha led a heke to Taranaki in that year with those peoples. The following year he moved further south and conquered Ngāti Apa, Rangatani and the other Kura Haupo peoples right down to the southern tip of the North Island, and Te Rauparaha set up a base on Kapiti. Meanwhile, the remnants of Ngāti Apa and Rangatani joined their relatives Ngāti Kuia in the top of the south and plotted Utu, which they attempted to exact in 1824-1825 in an enormous battle on the northern end of Kapiti. It's very tempting to assume that this was an outpost that Ngāti Kuia would have used to see what threat was coming from across the strait. Ngāti Kuia, Rangatani and Ngāti Apa were unsuccessful in the battle on Kapiti and were heavily defeated. The remnants escaped to the south, and one of the warrior rangatira, Tuti Puangiangi, was forced by Ngāti Koata and Ngāti Toa to stand in the waka Kapakapa Pānui around here somewhere and cede the lands of Rangitoto ki te Tonga, D'Urville Island, and the Rangitoto Islets and all the surrounding lands to Ngāti Toa and Ngāti Koata. Now, Ngāti Kuia has a different interpretation of the event there, and they certainly maintain to this day that the arrangement was for joint governance of the area. Be that as it may, Ngāti Koata established themselves in this area. Tute Puangiangi became a respected elder of both iwi, and various marriages were arranged so that the ties between Ngāti Kuia and Ngāti Koata might be cemented further. However, Te Rauparaha had other ideas, and Tute Puangiangi was killed in a raid a few years later. The arrival of Ngāti Koata was followed quite closely by the arrival of European settlers. A series of land purchases followed. Some of them were extremely dubious, even by the standards of the day. The New Zealand Company acquired the entire northern South Island in 1839 for not very much. The government reduced the amount of land involved in that, but settler pressure for land led to a process which was only going to go one way. The creation of the Native Land Court, later to become known as the Native Land Taking Court, led to the force-fitting of traditional ownership into the concept of European land title. This process came to D'Urville Island and environs in 1883, when 79 Ngāti Koata owners were identified and given undivided title to the island and its surrounds, including Puangiangi. Ngāti Koata preeminence was recognised by the Native Land Court because of the conquest of Ngāti Kuia by Ngāti Koata. So Ngāti Kuia might well disagree with the interpretation of that, but that's what the Native Land Court did. It took a further 12 years until 1895 for D'Urville to be partitioned further. At that time it was divided into 11 blocks, and each block had a list of owners, a subset of the original 79, in undivided shares. Each owner of 80 acres on main D'Urville Island also got 1 acre of the surrounding 55 islands, including Puangiangi, again undivided. Those owners were prevented by law from selling a block or their individual interest in it. They could only lease it on 21-year terms to someone else. The idea was that this would prevent the owners from being disenfranchised and dispossessed, but in reality it served more to stymie them from making progress with their lives. They'd already seen in this district in the last decade their potato crops fail due to blight and drought. Their sheep disappear because of an outbreak of scab in 1885. Forestry and mining ventures fall over, and many had left the region around 1890. Rents for any land leased was not enough to develop land where the owners lived, and so they were stuck. Those who stayed on the land were not generating enough income often to improve their farms, and there was precious little labour around given the general depopulation. Among the few people that were still living in the area, one Roma Hoira Te Ruruku was very prominent. He actually brought the Mormon religion to the area, and in 85-86 was running a small flock of sheep on Puangiangi. So far as we know, he never lived here. In fact, he lived on Tinui, as did his parents at one point. So I guess ecologically speaking, we would have almost certainly seen the small rat of the Pacific, Kiori, here, possibly from Ngāti Tūmatakokiri times, certainly by the arrival of Ngāti Koata, and Kiori might already have been getting displaced by Norway rats with the arrival of more intensive farming. Kiori were present on Tinui and Whakatiri Papanui, and presumably were here, but when records were kept, it was only Norways that were on Puangiangi. Roma Hoira Ruruku's daughter, Wetakia, is very famous, and there's a book about her. She married a man called Elkington, and there are many Elkingtons in the district today, some of whom I know quite well. Roma Hoira Te Ruruku moved around a bit, and he may not have been farming here for that long. Records show that he later settled on the southern end of main D'Urville Island. But some farmers and general storekeepers from Seddon and most likely Picton, Messrs Fuller and McCormick, were leasing Puangiangi, possibly informally, in the 1890s. That pair also farmed Pātuki on D'Urville, which are our nearest neighbours, and it's the only station that's farmed full-time now, I think. Puangiangi would have been an adjunct to that much larger operation. There's no physical trace of Roma Hoira Tururuku here or of Fuller and McCormick, save for the pasture lands. The forest would have been burnt at the time. That's their contribution to the modern day ecology. I'm near the northern end of Puangiangi. Behind me is the northern island, Whakatiri Papanui, and 10 kilometres to the north is Takapurewa, or Stevens Island. Straight over there, out of shot I think, is Pātoki Station, which has a bit of relevance to Whakatiri. In 1903, eminent naturalist Henry Travers had been visiting Takapurewa and was familiar with the abundant bird and wildlife out there. In 1903 he wrote to Colonial Secretary Sir Joseph Ward as follows. A year or so later, cats were introduced. I was there a few weeks ago and there is not a native land bird left on the island in consequence of the depredation of the cats. Of course, the birds lost included the extinction of the Stevens Island wren. This letter came to light courtesy of Dr. Colin Muskelly at Te Papa, who's curator of vertebrates there, but also an avid historian. This letter is the first overt mention of the possibility of rangitotos being valuable to conservation. Travers was ahead of his time in that he wasn't schooled in the idea that native birds and animals would get on just fine if their habitat were protected, which was kind of a continental viewpoint where habitat protection was the important thing, and those animals had evolved in the presence of mammalian predators for millions of years and so had mechanisms to deal with it. Travers was already onto it and had advocated for the removal of cats and pigs from Kapiti Island before it became a bird sanctuary. He went on in his letter to Joseph Ward as follows. I also venture to suggest that a number of the tuatara lizards be placed on the two rangitoto islets on which there is bush. This would prevent any possible chance of their becoming extinct in this portion of the colony. The two islets he meant would have been Puangiangi and Tinui because there's quite a lot of farming infrastructure on Whakatiri courtesy of Fuller and McCormick, who farmed Pātoki, and they would have been burning Whakatiri quite regularly by 1903. Leaving aside the fact that tuatara is not a lizard and has its own distinct reptilian lineage separate from lizards, Travers showed great foresight, but it would have been a bit forlorn moving tuatara over to here because Norway rats were already established. Travers wouldn't have known that the rats were already here, and I think this letter is a very important document showing conservation thinking coming to the Rangitoto group very early on. Henry Travers' wish came true 96 years later. Peter Gaze and Mike Avis, among others at the Department of Conservation, were able to get rid of Norway rats from the Rangitoto group, and then they, in conjunction with Nikki Nelson and Sue Keel from Victoria University with endorsement by iwi Ngāti Koata, released several hundred tuatara on Whakatiri Papanui.